Hello, everybody. Ej here. For anybody new here, I do casual reviews, but today I'm going to be doing something that's going to be very big. I'm going to be doing a Depeche Mode tier ranking video. For anybody that doesn't know, I listen to so much music. I love so much new music, love so much old music. But if there's one band that I genuinely love everything they have done, it is Depeche Mode. And what I mean by genuinely love, I mean I can find enjoyment in everything they put out. So I figured, why not go the extra mile? Here, let me show you. Let me share my screen. Let's take a look. So here is what we have going on here. I put together a tier ranking of pretty much everything Depeche Mode has done in the studio, so all 14 studio albums, plus all of their live albums, as well as all of Dave and Martin's solo albums. I didn't include Recoil because I have not dived too deep into Recoil, but besides that, I have in-depth listened to all of these. Now, you might also notice that the actual tier ranking here goes from, above average to magnum opus, or around a 6 out of 10 to a 10 out of 10. Yes, that everything that is listed here falls somewhere in that range. I am not joking. So yeah, let's just get right into this. So I'm going to start with their debut album in 1981. Where do I think it falls on this overall tier ranking? Speak and Spell is a very interesting album in their catalog. It's the only one written by Vince Clarke, and overall it is a very much more lighthearted, a very much more not that dark of a sound, a very synth pop, new romantic friendly sound, very primitive as well. The instrumentation was much more analog, a lot less experimentative. If I had to put it somewhere on here, I would put it in the good tier, 70 to 74, or like around a 7 out of 10. While I really do enjoy the album, I do think that it is not their best, and I think pretty much every studio album of theirs would see some sort of improvement upon this point in the future. I do think that the writing is a bit more primitive, a lot less in-depth, mainly due to this Vince Clarke's more accessible writing, but needless to say, I feel comfortable putting Speak and Spell from 1981 in the good tier. Next, we have A Broken Frame. It's very easy to see why this album gets a fair amount of criticism in the fan base. I see a lot of people criticize it for being a little outdated sounding, a little too weird and odd. But I also do genuinely think that this is a step in the right direction. Depeche Mode may have a few cheesy, kind of corny songs on here, but they definitely were starting to experiment more. Martin had adopted songwriting duties, and overall, the album was a bit of a darker sound than Speak and Spell. And I think overall, it was a good, like I said, step in the right direction. I actually love some of the more experimental, weird, avant-garde type moments on here. I feel pretty comfortable putting A Broken Frame in the great tier from 80 to 84 range. I think that it is just a really overlooked album. There's a lot of gems on there. The Sun and the Rainfall is an excellent track. Even My Secret Garden, while it is a bit weird and off-putting, it is a really great song in their early career. And obviously the singles See You and Leave in Silence are also some of my favorites. Without a doubt, I think the album deserves more praise. Next up, we have 1983's Construction Time Again. Arguably even more experimental than 1982's Broken Frame. Construction Time Again really sees the band for the first time bring more industrial sounds into their style, with a lot of samples of sort of metal clinging together. And genuinely speaking, well, the only real big song off this album is Everything Counts. This is arguably one of their most experimental albums in their entire career. I don't think that from an individual song basis, it's necessarily the greatest. I feel like it's an album that needs to be listened to as a whole instead of track by track, like separately. So I feel pretty solidly putting it in the very good tier, around 75 to 79. I don't think it grabs me nearly as much as A Broken Frame, but it is a really great industrial album. A lot of great industrial sounds. One of my favorite tracks is Pipeline, which is one of their most industrial tracks in their entire career. So I feel pretty comfortable putting Construction Time Again in that very good tier. Now, let's go to Some Great Reward. This is the fourth album from 1984, and to me, this is everything they had done up until this point, but really much more well-rounded and much more well-crafted, to say the least. It takes the industrial sound of an album like Construction Time Again, but also blends it with the bit more accessibility that you get on either Speak and Spell and A Broken Frame, and the end result was an album packed with hits like People Are People, Master and Servant, though I really do think the crowning jewel on this album is Blasphemous Rumors, one of Martin's best lyrical songs ever written, one of the most touching and even a little bit depressing, but in a good way. Songs in their entire career, and overall, I think the album is really well put together. I do think they would go on to make much better albums. I do think they would go on to improve upon their sound even more, but I feel pretty comfortable putting Some Great Reward in the excellent tier. It's a very good, concise album, only 9 tracks long. And almost every track packs a powerful punch, but I just think that they would go on to make better albums, and that's why it's in the excellent tier and not magnificent. So now we get, though, to some of the big heavy hitters. Black Celebration from 1986. Right off the bat, this was a major improvement from everything they had done up until this point. They still have some of the more darker sounds that they were experimenting with on A Broken Frame, but also some of that industrialness as well. But I feel pretty comfortable putting this in the magnum opus tier. I actually give this a 10 out of 10. I think that, Black Celebration also brought in some more gothic influence in there as well, which was a new thing for them. And overall, there's a great dynamic between Dave and Martin on here, where Martin takes the lead on a lot of the more ballady tracks, whereas some of the more darker, gritty and romantic, even synth pop tracks like Stripped, for example, Dave takes the lead. And overall, everything comes together great. The transitions are nice. It's really well produced, really well written. I feel comfortable putting Black Celebration towards the top. And next we have Music for the Masses. Pretty much everything I like about Black Celebration, and it just continued over in a bit more of a package that is more suitable for their live show, which was getting better with each and every tour. And I also genuinely think that, from the opening guitar sample on Never Let Me Down Again to that hidden track at the end of Pimp, this is one of their best track lists. Like, in terms of the way it's laid out perfectly. I feel comfortable putting this right up there in the magnum opus tier. Without a doubt, excellent album. I honestly don't have too much else to say here other than the fact that I think there's really not a single song that drags this project down, and it is right up there with Black Celebration. Now, here's where we get to the first actual solo project. This is the Counterfeit EP from Martin Gore. Now, to anybody that doesn't know this, what happened was, essentially after an extremely successful decade, great tours, great albums, it was really time for Martin to go solo. And the Counterfeit EP is a short EP of relatively obscure cover songs, and yet Martin somehow seems to make it his own. All of these songs end up being crafted into a very Depeche Mode sounding thing. And while the production might not be on par with some of Depeche Mode's works, I do think that Martin's beautiful vocals and the tracks that he chose fit him perfectly. His arrangements fit perfectly to his style. I don't think it doesn't knock your socks off or anything, but it is a great collection of obscure covers, really reworked to fit Martin's style quite a bit. And his voice is beautiful. I think the big highlight here is In a Manner of Speaking, one of his best solo songs in his whole career. I feel pretty good putting this in the great tier, that 80 to 84 range. Like I said, it's not the most impressive thing I have ever heard, but it's pretty damn good, and I think that Martin did a great job making these cover songs his own. And then we get to the first live album, or at least the first full-length live album, Depeche Mode 101. Now, it would be a sin to talk about Depeche Mode 101 without talking about the excellent sort of documentary/rockumentary that went with it, that followed the fans in the 80s. Excellent. Probably the best concert film, in my opinion, of all time. And how does the actual album fare with it? I might be one of the few people in the whole Depeche Mode fan base that actually prefers Depeche Mode with a live drummer. Obviously, that didn't come until the late 90s with Christian Eigner. That's my personal preference, but that's not really taking anything away from 101. Depeche Mode 101 is an extremely solid live album that captured the essence, I feel, of the Music for the Masses tour and just the cult following they had by the late 80s. I feel pretty comfortable putting this in the excellent tier, 85 to 89. You know, like I said, my personal taste, I personally do prefer them with a drummer, but I can't deny the fact that this is an excellent album without a doubt. And I mean, it's a classic live album, and it was definitely the album that set the standard for their live works. And with that being said, let's just get into the next Depeche Mode studio album, Violator. There's nothing really else I could say about Violator that hasn't already been said before. And I know that might sound cliche, but it is a magnum opus, 100% 10 out of 10 album. Honestly, my favorite album ever recorded, no matter the artist of all time. You know, everything good about Depeche Mode comes together on that album. From, you know, it opens with the dark, you know, gritty, I mean, just like the dark synth dance track, World in My Eyes. Then you have the more electronic bluesy track, Personal Jesus. And then you have Enjoy the Silence, which is honestly might just be my favorite single of all time. You know, from front to finish, this is a relatively concise album. Once again, only 9 tracks long, and every single song here is perfect. You know, you have the great, more dance-oriented synth tracks, and it has a very dark, overlying tone. But then you also get some of the more Martin-sung ballads like Blue Dress and Sweetest Perfection, which are some of their best. Like I said, there's not really much else to say about Violator that hasn't already been said before, but I think it is a perfect album. And now we move to Songs of Faith and Devotion. To say the 90s was a rough time for the band from like their own personal lives would be an understatement. I mean, Dave's drug problem had gotten to an absolute worst point. Martin's drinking as well. And overall, the band was really on the verge of breaking up. And but in terms of musicality, they brought a lot of alternative rock into their sound with Songs of Faith and Devotion. And overall, I think that despite all the craziness going on, it still turned out to be a relatively good album. Now, however, I don't think Songs of Faith and Devotion was necessarily at the same level as these 3 up here, Black Celebration, Music for the Masses, and Violator. It is a pretty magnificent album, and that's why I put it in the magnificent tier, 90 to 94. It has some of their deepest lyrics by far. I think you know, Alan played a huge role in this album. Alan really was, in many ways, the main person behind a lot of the production alongside Flood, because at the end of the day, the band's dynamic was really getting messed up. And the end result was a really well-crafted album. Even if I don't think it's their absolute best, it is an extremely well-crafted album. That being said, I do think that because the band's dynamic simply wasn't as good as it once was, and the chemistry amongst the members was really getting really bad, and they were all in a bad place, I do feel like that's the main reason why it gets dragged down, because I feel like there are a few tracks on here, like Rush, for example, that I think are good, but aren't their best. But keep in mind, we're like comparing like the greatest albums ever made here. I mean, it's right up with these guys, but I feel comfortable putting it in the tier right below it in magnificent. So then we get to their second real live album, Songs of Faith and Devotion Live. Now, to me, this is an interesting one because I do enjoy it. I enjoy it quite a bit. And just like 101, you can't really bring up Songs of Faith and Devotion Live without bringing up Devotional, the Grammy-nominated concert film that is an excellent concert without a doubt. And like I said before, a few of the same flaws from a personal standpoint still apply. Like, I prefer them with a drummer. This one obviously doesn't really have Christian yet. But overall, I think that this album does capture the essence of the Devotional tour quite well, as expected. I mean, the actual recordings themselves are great. But there is one thing hindering this album, and I think it's the fact that it only features songs that were already on Songs of Faith and Devotion. So you don't get Everything Counts, you don't get Enjoy the Silence or anything like that. You only really get the songs that were already on the first album, or on the Songs of Faith and Devotion album. So unfortunately, I mean, it's still a very good album. I still really, really like this live album, and I put it in the very good tier. I don't think it's nearly as good as 101 or some of their later live albums, but it is definitely a good kind of like little time capsule of the Devotional tour. It's all right. What can I say? And that it's also worth noting that is the final release on here with Alan Wilder. So now the next one we have to talk about is Ultra. What do I think about Ultra? Well, I'm just going to put it right where I think. Magnum opus. Now, that might be a bit controversial. A lot of people, once Alan left, felt that the band had seen a drop in quality. I strongly disagree. I think that if anything, Ultra was the perfect bounce back after Alan's departure and definitely proved that the band was still making some of the best electronic music there. Not only does this album have some of the best singles like It's No Good, Home, Useless, etc., which also kind of still have a bit of that sort of alternative sound, but it does have a bit of down tempo in there as well. I also think the second half of Ultra is one of their best record sides in their entire career. I mean, it has some of their most beautiful and mellow compositions, like Sister of Night and The Bottom Line, two of my favorite songs in their entire career. That's why I feel really comfortable. I have very little flaws with Ultra. I think it is the perfect comeback, and it is a near perfect album. So that is why Ultra is, in my opinion, in the magnum opus section. Then we get to Exciter. Exciter is another album that seems to get a fair amount of criticism, and I understand why it gets a good amount of criticism. It is a very different sounding album in their career. I mean, it's not as dark as their previous albums. It's a much brighter sounding album, and it's much more digital sounding as well. And I actually feel like it plays off a lot of the more mellow sides of Ultra as well. But I do think that it is a massively underrated album. And I think there is a lot of greatness going on here. It gets a lot of criticism for being different, but I do think that Mark Bell's great production, the more lush soundscapes and the more digitalness here and the more experimentation overall across the board and interesting instrumentation. Dave's vocals sound honestly better than ever on this album. I feel pretty comfortable putting it in the excellent tier from that 85 to 89 range. Like I said, I mean, it is an album that they kicked off the new millennia with an album that sounded very different from anything they had put out in the past. And yet somehow, in my opinion, they managed to make it work. I mean, it does sound very different from anything that came before or after it. But I think the very lusciousness of it, it's even a bit ambient in many spots with kind of very unique instrumentation and very watery sounding on Comatose, for example. But I think Exciter is a really excellent album that I just wish I got more credit. Now we go into the two albums from Dave Gahan and Martin Gore that came out in 2003, the second round of solo albums and Dave's debut. But first we have Counterfeit 2, the first actual full-length album from Martin. And this is it's called Counterfeit 2 or Counterfeit Squared. I don't know how you would really say it, but it is essentially the follow-up to the EP that he put out back in 1989. Though there are very few sonic similarities, this is another cover album with a lot of relatively obscure covers, but there is some well-known bluesy ones as well, like In My Time of Dying, which turned out to be one of the best. I do think that it does play off a lot of the sounds that Depeche Mode had done on Exciter. It's a very digital sounding album. However, I don't think that every single song on here plays the massive impact that the Counterfeit EP does. However, I still think it was a relatively good, it was a very good sounding cover EP or cover album. Martin sounds great. It's very kind of laid back, very chill, kind of what you would expect from a Martin album. And I feel pretty comfortable putting it in the very good tier. I come back to this album actually quite a bit. There are quite a few songs on this cover album that I think are some of my favorite covers in general. And they're very mellow, very pleasant to listen to, and the production is very nice. However, I just don't think every single track always necessarily does it for me. But I feel pretty comfortable putting it from that 75 to 79 range right here in the very good. Now we have Paper Monsters by Dave Gahan. This is his debut, solo debut, and it's interesting. It has Dirty Sticky Floors, which I still think is his best single he's put out solo from Depeche Mode. Really great banger. You really can't go wrong with that song. And this album also contains Stay, one of my favorite, more orchestral songs in his entire career. In fact, I think it might be his best solo song. However, the album as a whole, I do think does have some flaws. It's still a good album. It's still one I come back to time and time again. But the flaws do seem to show with age. And I'm going to put Paper Monsters in the good tier right alongside Speak and Spell. I don't think it's bad. Don't take this the wrong way. I do enjoy it. However, I just don't think it is nearly at the same level as much of the stuff he also did in his career. And I think that even in terms of his later solo albums, I think he would go on to make better solo albums. But, kicking off your solo career with a good album around that 70 to 74 range is really good. So now let's move on to 2005's Depeche Mode album, Playing the Angel. Just a wonderful album. I really don't know how to really put it in words, how just great this album is. It got a lot of criticism upon release for the production, mainly the the compression on this album. However, future mixes and the vinyl as well don't have that problem. To me, well, Exciter was a much more digital, much more sparse and ambient, and even a bit more experimental album. In many ways, Playing the Angel kind of brought it back to the roots. It was a much more darker album. There was a few dance songs on there as well, but also the real high point here is some of their best lyrics, some of their best compositions, some of the best deep cuts. I'm putting this in the magnum opus tier. Now, that might seem 5 albums in the magnum opus tier. I warned you ahead of time. I have a really big bias towards Depeche Mode, and I love Depeche Mode. So that's why there's so many up there. But I really do think Playing the Angel is one of their greatest albums. Every deep cut is just as impactful as the singles. Dave first started writing on Playing the Angel and wrote some of the band's best material, like Suffer Well and I Want It All, some of their best songs. And just in general, I think that Playing the Angel was an excellent milestone in their career that proved even after the 80s and 90s and after the departure of one of their main members, they can come back in the next decade with one of their best albums. And to me, Playing the Angel perfectly fits there. And songs like Precious, for example, are some of their greatest singles of all time and some of the most heart-wrenching as well. So now let's go into their next live album, which is Touring the Angel, which accompanied the Live in Milan DVD, I believe. Interesting. This live album has some of the same flaws that the Songs of Faith and Devotion live had. It only features songs that were on Playing the Angel, which is a bit of an issue for me because I would love to hear more of the songs. But I feel like this captures the essence of the show. This is also their first live album that features a drummer, which is something I am quite fond of. I think that having a drummer and having Peter Gardino and Christian Eigner up there add a new energy to the band that was missing in previous live settings, and I think adds new life to the band. However, I'm going to put it in the great tier. I think it is a really good sounding. I actually was just listening to it earlier today on my walk. It's a really good, well-produced, short little live album, only 8 songs, but it does capture the essence, I think, of the Playing the Angel tour. And Dave sounds relatively good. Everybody sounds good here. And I think Christian Eigner has this album features a good blend of Christian's acoustic drumming, along with some electronic drumming as well. So overall, I think it was a really well put together way to encapsulate the tour. I think it could have been in the excellent tier if they added more songs, but unfortunately they didn't. So it's only going to be in the great tier, but that means it's still pretty good. And now we move on to Dave Gahan's second solo album, Hourglass. After Paper Monsters, I feel like, and after Depeche Mode kind of revitalized their sound on Playing the Angel, Dave's next solo album really did tackle a bit more of an electronic sound, arguably his most electronic solo album yet. And I think it turned out really good. I think that Dave sounded much more passionate and much more into it, I think, on this album than I think he did on his debut solo album. And I feel pretty comfortable putting it also in that great tier. This is one that kind of took a while to grow on me. I've come back to it a few times, though, and it has since become one of my favorite solo albums in his career. I think that it is a great representation of not only Dave tackling a bit more of an electronic sound on a solo album, but also blending that sort of bluesy influence that he's sort of known for. Oftentimes for his solo albums, he always has some sort of bluesiness in there, some sort of rock influence. And I think that Hourglass is a really good blend of the two. I think he actually would go on to make a better album, but I will get to that later. But I do think Hourglass songs like Saw Something are some of his best solo songs, and one of my personal favorites is Deeper and Deeper, which sounds like it could be from like Marilyn Manson or some shit. Excellent track. Everybody needs to check that out. Then we get to Sounds of the Universe. This is a pretty funny album to me because I see people hate on this album so much. And I get a little angry because I find a lot of songs are really good. But that being said, I'm not going to overly defend this album. I'm not going to say it's a magnum opus or magnificent. I do think it is a really good album that has a lot of underrated tracks. I mean, obviously the song Wrong is the big one. But when we look at songs like Fragile Tension, In Sympathy, Little Soul, Corrupt, some of their best, more newer songs per se. I get the criticisms. It is a much more, it doesn't have the same charm that I would say Playing the Angel has, really not at all. But it is still a really well put together album. And I settle on putting it though in the very good tier. It is a good album. Don't get me wrong. It's in the very good tier, so I like it quite a bit. However, I just don't think it reaches the level that an album like Playing the Angel or Exciter did in the more modern era of the band. I feel like both those albums really did push the band's sound in a new direction, and I really just don't feel like Sounds of the Universe did that too much. However, I do think, Sounds of the Universe plays off of that sort of analog kick that they're on with Playing the Angel and sort of goes right down that same stylistic route. But there's a lot of really good songs on here, a lot of great underrated songs on Sounds of the Universe as well that need much more credit and that I wish got much more attention. So that is why Sounds of the Universe is in the very good tier. Overall, every time I listen to it, I get a lot of enjoyment from it. I genuinely enjoy listening to it. However, when I actually think in the grand scheme of their career, I recognize that it didn't push them in any new directions or anything like that. But I still think it's a good album that gets massively shit on way too much and that everybody should check it out. And now we have Touring the Universe live in Barcelona. And bit of a spoiler alert, this will be my lowest ranking one. I enjoy it. I think that the performance is actually really good. I know Dave, this might be the spot where Dave might sound most wishy-washy just because he was having a lot of health problems at the time, but for the most part, he's very tolerable here. Everything sounds relatively good. However, the production on this one for me, for some reason, I don't know what it is, but it sort of turns me off a little bit. And I put it in the decent tier. It is good. It is decent. But there is just something about the way that live album is produced that for some reason turns me off a little bit. It's not produced like a Depeche Mode album. It's hard to explain. I don't know how in depth I want to get, but I don't think it is nearly as impactful as the next live album I'm going to talk about. It's still a good performance, still a great video. It's just, unfortunately, I think that it is their lowest ranking release. But let's get right into the next release, MCMG. This was a collaborative project between Vince Clarke and Martin Gore. And even though I know I wasn't sort of including Recoil stuff, you might be wondering, why am I including a Vince Clarke thing? Well, Martin's on here, so I wanted to include it. I put this in the good tier. I think that Martin would go on to really improve upon his more electronic sounds that he was experimenting with. I think he would go on to make it even better. But I do think that, MCMG is a really interesting collaboration between the two. They hadn't worked together in quite some time, so it's sort of nice to hear them get back in the routine of things. Not really too much else to say here. Really good instrumental. It's not my favorite, but it is good. That's why it's in the good tier. And now we get one I'm really excited to talk about, Soul Savers, Light the Dead Sea. Now, even though this is only considered a Soul Savers, Dave Gahan singing on here, so I consider this a Dave Gahan and Soul Savers thing. To me, this is an excellent album from Dave and Soul Savers. I think that it has a really, really strong track list. And honestly, this is the first album really where Dave sort of ditches the synthesizer. It's a pretty bluesy, pretty rocky and indie sounding album. And I think Dave's voice sounds great on here, really great. His vocals at this point are starting to age a little more. This was released in 2012. And I'm putting it in the excellent tier, right alongside Exciter and Some Great Reward and stuff. To me, it is a really underrated, overlooked album, oftentimes because Dave's name isn't attached to it, but I think it is one of the best solo albums I have heard from any of them. I think that Dave sounds excellent, and Dave also wrote a lot of these lyrics, and it has some of his most personal and just great lyrics. Presence of God, I think, is one of Dave's best written songs he's ever written. Yeah, I feel pretty comfortable putting The Light, The Dead Sea in the excellent tier. I just wish more people appreciated it. And then we get the next Depeche Mode album, Delta Machine. This is an album that I do enjoy it quite a bit. I think I enjoyed it a little bit more when I first heard it. That being said, I still like it a lot. And I still think that their blend of electronic sounds with blues really paid off with one of their best albums. What I mean is that one of their best albums when it comes down to tackling blues in their sound as well. I'm going to put this in the great tier, 80 to 84. I think it really does. I think the end result did pay off, and this album did produce some of their best deep cuts, like Broken, one of my favorites, and even some of the best singles as well, like Should Be Higher in Heaven, two of their best, more recent singles. But I think that Delta Machine really did pay off as an album. I don't think it went the extra step, and I don't think it was magnificent or anything like that, but really solid album from them. Definitely, I actually really did enjoy the more bluesiness on songs like Slow and Soothe My Soul, but I'm going to put it in the great tier. And then we have Live in Berlin, 2013. I have been wanting to talk about this one because this one might be a bit more of a controversial opinion of mine, but I love this live album a lot. Like I said before, I think that Depeche Mode with a live drummer has more of an impact than them when they don't have one. I know that's unpopular, but, I think it's good. So many things are going for this album. It's produced greatly. There's a great blend of the actual drums, the synthesizers, the vocals, everything. It sounds like what's one of the most well-produced live albums I've ever heard. Let me put it at that. The performances are on the spot. They all sound great. Dave's voice sounds excellent here. Martin sounds great here. Everybody's on top of their game. And also, the song selection is wonderful. It's like 22 songs or something like that. Great blend of songs from Delta Machine, but also a lot of other songs from their older material in the 80s and 90s. And to me, it lands in the magnificent tier. It is my favorite live album they have put out. And even though it's from 2013 and they're older now, I still think they sound better than ever on this album. And I have no shame putting it in the magnificent tier, even though I know a lot of people might not agree with me. I think that it is one of the best produced and best sounding live albums I have ever heard from any band. So that is why Live in Berlin lands in the magnificent tier. So now we get to another round of solo albums, and let's start with Martin. MG, the MG album. What do I think? Where do I put it? This, in many ways, is sort of a continuation of that whole VCMG thing I was talking about. It's a very instrumental, very analog, very synth-oriented album. But I think it's very good. I'm putting it in the very good tier. I think it is a step up from MCMG. And I do think that, well, it's not like some of their previous albums. It's not really an album you listen to random tracks here and there. It's more of a full experience. And songs like Europa Hymn and Pinking are some of his best kind of experimental analog instrumental songs. Really good electronic album. Not much else to say here, but I put that in the very good tier. It's definitely a pleasing listen, and I like it quite a bit. And we also have Angels and Ghosts, which I am also going to put in the very good tier. Really, really good. I don't think this is Dave Gahan from 2015's next album with Soul Savers, but I don't think it's necessarily as good as the first Soul Savers album with Dave, but he continues to be riding high here. I mean, he's still putting out good music. He's still riding that bluesy wave, and I appreciate that quite a bit. And overall, really solid album. Dave continues to grow as a songwriter, and yeah, it's a very good album. Not the greatest, but really good nonetheless. And now we get to the final two. Let's start with Spirit. Spirit. This is another one that might be a bit controversial because this album does sometimes get a bit of unfair criticism, but I think that Spirit has some of the band's best lyrics, some of their most focused, more political and just social lyrics. And I think that they wrote it in a way that is timeless and excellent. I think production-wise, this is one of their best produced albums in their entire career. Instrumentally or musically, this has some of their most interesting compositions. Songs like Scum, You Move, and even songs like Eternal, I think have some of their most intriguing compositions in their entire career. I'm going to put it in the magnificent tier. I love this album. I think that it gets a bit too much criticism. I think that at the end of the day, it is a really well produced album, a really, 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 really well written album. You know, the compositions are amazing. Songs like Fail are the perfect closers to an album. And Martin and Dave just sound as urgent as ever, as energized as ever. And I love Spirit. So I am putting Spirit in the magnificent tier. I wish the album got more praise, but what am I going to do about that? And then the final release I'm going to be talking about is Live Spirits. Their latest album, or I should say their latest live album. This one seemed to have a bit of mixed reception too amongst the initial release. Not too many people had any issue with the actual performance. Many people had issues with the production, and I actually completely understand. I do think from a production standpoint, it's not at the same level as Live at Berlin per se. But either way, the actual performance was amazing. And even though the production might not be the greatest, I'm going to put it in the very good tier. I think that they sound great. The track list was wonderful. I loved the abundance of songs from Ultra, which obviously is one of my favorites. And at the end of the day, I thought it was a relatively good album. And with that being said, this is my Depeche Mode tier ranking. To put this in perspective, let's see. The criteria for an album to make my great classic album series is very basic. I'm very lenient. It needs to have at least an 8 out of 10 or higher and play a significant role. But if you take that out of the picture, that means that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 albums from either Depeche Mode or solo or live albums are eligible to be in the Great Classic Album series. So that is an excellent track record. And above that, in order to get ranked on my end of year list, you need to have higher than a 7. So that means every album here, except for the Barcelona one, would make it. Depeche Mode is without a doubt my favorite band of all time. They are my Beatles. They are my Rolling Stones. They are my Beethoven. And I know that I have bias. They are the first band I really got into. They are the band that got me into music. But also, I really don't care. I've made it clear on this channel that this is a very casual thing. I'm not working for Pitchfork here. This is just my opinion, and I love Depeche Mode, and I love pretty much everything they have done. So, yeah, I just thought it would be fun for me to do this. I mean, I don't know what the reception of this video is going to be. I'm sure some older fans are going to have some shit to say about my rankings, but who cares? I mean, I love Depeche Mode. I love this band. I love pretty much everything they do. And when the day I upload this, Martin's going to be releasing the third Chimpanzee EP, so look forward to my review of that. With that being said, goodbye. Listen to these albums, or else. No, I'm joking, but for real, these are great albums. Depeche Mode's an excellent band. Not obviously, it's not for everybody, but at least these magnum opus ones, I think, and magnificent, everybody should give in-depth listen. Some of their best. So that is it for now. And let's see, how do I end this? Here we go. Goodbye.